Hello, my History 116 students. This is your professor, Donald Earl Collins. This is week one of this world history from 1500 to the present course. Hi. If you're listening to this, it's more likely I did not do the face-to-face class for week one. So this is a backup for the week one part of the course. Normally, I would go through a sequence that would include introductions or introductions in pairs where one person introduces another person and so on. Then go through the whole gamut of things that are part of the syllabus, the different assignments that you have, how to do online discussions, how I'm grading you for this semester, what to expect of me, when to expect it of me, deadlines, and so on and so forth. The main things you need to know, I've already sent to you in an email from the first day of the course around alternate readings or optional readings, around where to find different things. The syllabus, the calendar, the announcements section, and content going through the different weeks, as well as the documents themselves, all have dates for when your projects or assignments are due over the course of a semester. Your multiple choice exam is due on April 1st. Your paper assignment is due on April 15th. And your final exam is due, I believe, on May 6th or 7th. I can't remember exactly where, but it's the end of the first week of May. So, and again, all of that stuff is in various places in Leo, and I will reiterate those in announcements and in other places over the course of the next 8 weeks. Discussion is worth 35% of your grade. That's the bottom line. More than a third of your grade is through discussion online and with a little bit of extra credit, so to speak, in terms of how I grade on a week-to-week basis based on the discussions that we have face-to-face in the classroom. Obviously, that won't be part of the array of discussion that we have this week since we can't discuss face-to-face for obvious reasons, but that's part of how I grade. Your multiple choice exam is worth a quarter of your grade. Paper assignment is worth, the multiple choice exam is worth 20% of your grade. Your paper assignment is worth 25% or a quarter. And your final exam is worth a fifth of your grade or 20% as well. So 35, 20 is 55, 55 and 25 is 80, 80 and 20 is 100. That's 100% of your grade. You get an extra point from doing your academic integrity tool or certificate, which is by rule you're supposed to have done by the end of the first week. It's not required, but second week. It's not required, but it should be done by the end of the second week. But in point of fact, I don't really care when you do it. I don't care if you finish it today, in the next week, as long as it's done by the time I'm doing final grades for the course around somewhere between May 7th and May 10th. Those are the dates when the class comes to an end and the 72-hour period in which I have to turn in your final grades. Once I have that, then I can add an extra point to your final grade, give you, a B or a C instead of a C or a D, or an A or a B instead of a B or a C. It makes that much of a difference. Those are the main things that I would cover probably in closer to 45 minutes or an hour, and not in like 2 minutes and change. So anyhow, the main thing I want to concentrate on today is really the first week. The first week of the course is really trying to situate you in world history, what world history is, where we are in terms of world history at the end of the 15th and beginning of the 16th century, some of the important themes around the second half of what is the world history curriculum at the survey level for college students. Where we are right now is approximately 1500 CE. That's AD for folks who don't know the difference between before the Common Era and the actual Common Era period in world history. Common Era is a nice little way of saying for those who are not Christian and believe in beasts and don't believe in Christianity, aren't followers of Christ, Common Era is just a way to cover things so that you don't just say AD as if everyone's Christian and BC as if everyone's Christian as well. So BC is before the Common Era and CE is the Common Era, and 1500 CE is where we are at the start of the course. What's happened at this point? in general world history, what you have is really the dominant theme in world history is China, Ming Dynasty China, the emergence of Mughal Dynasty India, um, Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, various kingdoms in West Africa and Southwest Central Africa, East African city-states, the Aztec Empire in Central America, what's now Mexico and parts of Guatemala, as well as the Incan Empire in Peru, Chile, parts of Bolivia, parts of Colombia. You have various other minor civilizations, kingdoms, etc., spread throughout the rest of the world. And you have minor kingdoms or relatively minor kingdoms and city-states in places like Central and Western Europe. That's not necessarily in order, that's just to give you a sense of the order of relative importance to their areas in terms of the world as a whole. That's the world in 1500. The reason why I'm putting it to you this way is pretty simple. The main fallacy with any world history course that any student rolls into when taking this course is that world history is defined by Western civilization, and particularly Western Europe, the United States, and industrialized nations of the world. That everything has to be understood through that lens over the period of time that there have been human civilizations, which has been approximately, give or take, 12,000, 15,000 years, depending on how you define a village, where people sit down for a little bit, settle down for a little bit to grow crops and domesticate animals. So, but that's not really world history, looking at it primarily through a Western European or Western civilization kind of lens. It's world history from that perspective, but it's not really world history. It's history of Western Europe. It's defined by Western Europeans. It's defined by the descendants of Western Europeans. It's defined by the benefactors of Western civilization. And that everything else is secondary. Well, not that everything is relative, but if you're really looking at the world in terms of who held most of the power, most of the wealth, most of the innovations around 1500 CE, then it's not Western Europe. The answer, depending on how you look at it, is going to be between the Ottoman Turks, who rule a good portion of what used to be the Arab Caliphate imperial world by 1500, which is basically the area between Northern Africa, parts of Eastern Europe, the entire Middle East, and parts of Central Asia. That's the Ottoman Empire, more or less, in 1500 CE. Or the emerging Mughal dynasty India, which is pretty much all of South Asia. In this case, South Asia is not just India. It's also what we now call Pakistan. It's parts of what we now also call Afghanistan. That all was considered part of South Asia until the breakup of South Asia at the end of British rule of South Asia or India in 1947, in which, as a result of their shenanigans, Pakistan and India became separate countries. Bangladesh eventually becomes a separate country from Pakistan, which formerly was known as East Pakistan, as a matter of fact, until 1971, and Sri Lanka and so on. And then, of course, there's Ming Dynasty China, which takes over at the end of this period, at the end of the rule of the Mongols in the period 150 years before 1500, and forms its own dynasty and covers parts of what is now known as Korea, modern-day China, Tibet, and actually Mongolia. So those are the three big world powers in the known world. What makes this period so special, why we start in 1500, is because about 8 years before 1500 CE, Columbus, quote-unquote, discovered the Western Hemisphere. Or to put it completely in a completely nuanced way, Christopher Columbus stumbled upon land that scholars had predicted would be there, but that he, for some odd reason, thought would not be there. He thought that the best way to circumvent Ottoman, Turk, and Italian city-state control over the Silk Road trade between Western Europe, the Middle East, India, and China, and the expenses that rich people incurred and kings and queens and nobles incurred in doing that trade was to go across the Atlantic Ocean and somehow sail the equivalent of 11,000 miles to East Asia, right? Which, by the way, clears up another myth, which is that people thought the world was flat, and Columbus proved the world was in flat round. When in point of fact, anybody with any education at all, even the most rudimentary education, knew that the world was round. And most people in the world had known this for at least about 2,500 years, give or take. The Greeks proved it in 300 BCE, but so did Indians in South Asia, probably around 500 BCE. Certainly, the Arab world knew that. The Chinese knew that. The kingdoms and civilizations of Sub-Saharan Africa knew that. Even most people in Western Europe knew this. It's a myth created mostly in the 19th century to sell, again, the larger point that we're trying to dispel with the world history course, that Western Europe was the originator of all complex scientific major breakthroughs in world history, which obviously isn't true. Anyway, so the main point here is to understand that this is regardless of how you look at it, regardless of what happens as a result of Columbus's quote-unquote discovery, or rather stumbling upon what we now know of as the Western Hemisphere, North and South America. The fact is, it's a major breakthrough in world history that for the first time, half of the world, the entire hemisphere of the world is now known to another half of the world that, had been trading with each other for a couple thousand years, at least, if not longer. And that's the Western Hemisphere. And that's a big break. That's a big break for Europe in particular. To be able to have this entire area to exploit in terms of resources, to populate potentially, to engage in trade, to do whatever with. It might not have seemed like that in 1492, or Columbus came back in 1493 to still try to find a passage to India, or in 1498 when he came back for a third time, or in 1502 when he came back a fourth time, or in 1506 when he died trying to come back a fifth time. Okay, but he did. But the point is that it was a breakthrough, and so this is a game changer in world history. Just like the rise of classical civilizations had been 1,500, 2,000 years earlier, or the rise of empires in the first place, which had happened approximately around 2,500 BCE to 2200 BC, the rise of what we would consider the first quote-unquote empire, small e, not big E. Those sorts of things. This is a major, major breakthrough. So that's the thing you need to think about this week. In what ways is this a breakthrough? While at the same time also recognizing and realizing that the world that we see the world being in 2017, the one where Western culture is world culture, where when you say the West, you think of Western Europe as being this place of advanced civilization, of people living in developed, industrialized, or post-industrial countries with wealth and resources, with generally more stable governments and more stable environments, and so on and so forth. That was not the case 500 and something years ago. It was not. Just if you compared Ming Dynasty China to Europe, it would be kind of like, in terms of technological advancement, it's kind of like comparing Western Europe of today to like the United States of 150, 200 years ago. Not that advanced. When you compare the riches of India 1500 CE to Western Europe in this period, it's equivalent comparing the United States to Haiti. The richest country on earth to the poorest country on earth. Simple as that. Western Europe compared to India was dirt poor in 1500 CE. When you compare the Ottoman Turks and their military prowess in 1500 CE to the rest of the world, they had the most powerful military in the world. They actually have the most powerful navy in the world. Yes, they suffered a defeat here and suffered a defeat there, but in all, the Ottomans conquered a good portion of the known world, approximately 4 million square miles of empire, in just under 100 years. Think about it that way. So that's one theme. The other theme is, wow, we've got this big, shiny new game changer over here that sailors and explorers and scientists and conquistadors and other groups of folks from Spain and Portugal, Italy, and other parts of Western Europe try to take advantage of, except for one small little issue. And that issue is that there are anywhere between 70 and 100 million indigenous people already living here, with some of them with major civilizations like the Aztecs and the Inca, some with not with semi-advanced or advanced enough, the Iroquois or the Navajo or the Sioux or other groups that lived in villages, sometimes engaged in agriculture, sometimes didn't. Had constitutions, had laws, had customs. But since the mid-19th century, we've portrayed these people as being naked and running around, and all they do is hunt and fish and eat wild berries and those sorts of things. Again, myths. Again, stereotypes. So part of what hopefully we can start to do this week is to break down some of these stereotypes around not only the people who are the most advanced in this period, but the people who are the least advanced. In point of fact, less advanced and more advanced is more about circumstance and a whole lot less about intelligence. In other words, the more you're able to trade and communicate with other groups of people who've made advances technologically, in terms of gaining wealth, in terms of military prowess, the more likely you're able to become more wealthy, have more military prowess, and gain more political power, and engage in more trade, and become richer as a result of all those things, materially and intellectually as well. But being intellectually richer is not the same thing as being intelligent, right? And so that's kind of the theme for the first week. One other thing to note about week one, it's kind of important too, is that a lot of what we understand in terms of what we eat, how we dress, what's useful in terms of our basic existence, starts to come together in this period as there's an exchange of ideas, of people, of technology, of raw material and goods between the Western and Eastern Hemisphere that takes place roughly from 1492 or 1500 CE until about the beginning of the 17th century. We have all kinds of foodstuffs and raw materials introduced between the two hemispheres. Some for good in terms of resources for different people, and some bad. It's called the Columbian Exchange. And the Columbian Exchange involves things like horses and cattle making their way across the ocean to the Western Hemisphere. Corn and potatoes and cacao, which is the fruit for chocolate, by the way, and vanilla beans, making its way across the Atlantic from the Western Hemisphere to Africa and Europe and Asia as well. Sweet potatoes, among other things. And in addition to that, people coming over. And those people sometimes bringing diseases with them, diseases that the indigenous populations of the Western Hemisphere just were not exposed to. And when you have a population that isn't exposed to certain kinds of diseases, the result is a lot of death. Perhaps as much as 90% of the population here in the Western Hemisphere died off between 1492 and the early part of the 17th century, certainly by 1700. So that's the first week, leaving you on the depressing note.